In the early 1930s, Europe was a continent holding its breath. Political tensions simmered beneath elegant cafe conversations and glittering ballroom evenings. In that uneasy world, a young woman from the far side of the globe was building what seemed to be an ordinary life. Her name was Nancy Wake. Born in New Zealand and raised in Australia, Nancy grew up fiercely independent. She was strong-willed, adventurous, and uninterested in the narrow expectations placed on women of her time. Journalism offered her something rare: mobility, access, and a front-row seat to history. By her early 20s, she had left Australia for Europe, determined to see the world for herself. She settled in Paris and later traveled to Vienna as a freelance reporter. It was there, in Austria, that she witnessed something that would permanently alter the course of her life. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. Nazism was no longer a fringe ideology, it was becoming state policy. While many outsiders still dismissed the movement as political theater, Nancy saw the brutality firsthand. She watched Jewish men and women being beaten in the streets by Nazi stormtroopers. She saw fear replacing culture in a city once known for music and philosophy. The violence was not rumor, it was immediate, physical, undeniable. Later, she would say that what she saw in Vienna made her hate the Nazis from the very beginning. By the late 1930s, Nancy was living in Marseille, France. She had married a wealthy French industrialist, Henri Fiocca. On the surface, her life seemed comfortable and secure. She attended dinners, hosted gatherings, and moved in upper-class circles. But war was closing in. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Europe plunged into war. In 1940, France fell to German forces with shocking speed. Paris was occupied. The south of France, including Marseille, fell under collaborationist control aligned with Berlin. Occupation changed everything. German officers filled the cafes. Informants whispered in alleyways. The secret police began to tighten their grip. The organization responsible for crushing dissent was the Gestapo. They specialized in infiltration, interrogation, and terror. Arrests often happened at night. Many who disappeared were never seen again. For Nancy, neutrality was impossible. At first, her involvement was small. She carried messages, she passed along information, she offered her apartment as a safe meeting place. But as the resistance networks grew, so did her role. Marseille became a key escape route for Allied soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. Downed British airmen needed to be smuggled out of France before capture. The journey was dangerous: forged documents, train rides under surveillance, long treks through mountain passes into Spain. Nancy became one of the organizers of these escape lines. She used her charm and confidence as camouflage. German officers often underestimated her. She spoke boldly, dressed elegantly, and projected the image of a carefree socialite. Behind that facade, she coordinated safe houses, secured false papers, and arranged transport. Each mission carried enormous risk. If caught, the consequences were severe: imprisonment, torture, execution. But Nancy had qualities that made her uniquely effective. She was fearless under pressure. She could think quickly, and she possessed a remarkable instinct for sensing danger. More than once, she narrowly avoided arrest. On one occasion, a warning reached her minutes before the Gestapo raided a building she had just left. On another, she talked her way past a checkpoint with forged papers that could have condemned her. Her ability to slip through tightening security began to frustrate German authorities. By 1942, the Gestapo had taken notice of the mysterious woman aiding escape networks in southern France. Interrogations of captured resistance members produced fragments of information. and foreign accent, dark hair, a woman who moved between social circles and underground cells with equal ease. They did not know her full identity, but they knew she was effective. The Germans placed a bounty on her head, 5 million francs. It was a staggering sum. Posters described her as one of the most dangerous Allied agents operating in France. They gave her a nickname, the White Mouse. The name reflected their frustration. Like a mouse, she seemed small and elusive. She slipped through their traps again and again. Surveillance teams lost her. Informants failed to track her movements. Raids produced empty rooms and burned documents. But the nickname also carried a darker meaning. A mouse is hunted relentlessly. The pressure intensified. Arrests within resistance networks increased. Torture extracted names. The Gestapo expanded its search. Nancy understood that the net was tightening. Her husband Henri supported her work, though it placed him in grave danger. Their marriage, once defined by comfort and prosperity, had transformed into a partnership bound by secrecy and risk. Every knock on the door could signal disaster. By 1943, southern France was no longer relatively safe. German forces occupied the entire country. The Gestapo's presence deepened. Safe houses were compromised. Escape routes collapsed. Nancy faced a decision: stay and almost certainly be captured, or flee and continue the fight from abroad. The journey out of France was one of the most dangerous chapters of her life. She joined a small group attempting to cross the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, a treacherous passage used by refugees and Allied personnel. The crossing required stamina and silence. Patrols guarded the routes. Guides demanded payment. Betrayal was always possible. Several attempts failed before she finally made it across. Arrested briefly by Spanish authorities, she managed to secure release. Eventually, she reached Britain. Behind her, in France, the Gestapo intensified their search. They questioned associates. They arrested her husband. Henri Fiocca was tortured and executed. He never revealed her location. Nancy would later learn of his death. The knowledge was devastating, yet those who knew her observed that grief hardened into resolve. If anything, it strengthened her commitment. By the time she arrived in Britain, Nancy Wake was no longer merely a resistance courier. She was a symbol of defiance. Her experience, contacts, and survival skills made her invaluable. British intelligence recognized her potential. She would soon be recruited by the Special Operations Executive, the organization tasked with conducting sabotage and supporting resistance movements in occupied Europe. But that transformation, from hunted fugitive to trained special operative, belonged to the next chapter of her story. At the end of 1943, one truth was undeniable. The woman the Gestapo had tried to trap for years had escaped their grasp. They had named her the White Mouse in frustration. They did not yet realize that she was about to return, better trained, better armed, and far more dangerous than before. By 1943, the net around Nancy Wake had tightened almost beyond escape. For years, she had moved through occupied France under the watchful eyes of the Gestapo, organizing escape lines, forging documents, bribing officials, and smuggling Allied airmen toward freedom. She had survived raids, interrogations of associates, and betrayals that destroyed entire resistance cells. But now the German occupation had hardened. Southern France was no longer a gray zone of divided authority. It was fully under Nazi control. Her name was circulating in interrogation rooms. The Gestapo had placed a bounty of 5 million francs on her head, an enormous sum, enough to tempt even loyal friends. They did not yet know her full identity, but they knew her code name. They knew she was foreign, and they knew she was effective. Every day she remained in France increased the risk not only to herself, but to everyone connected to her. The decision to flee was not simple. Leaving meant abandoning the network she had helped build. It meant leaving her husband, Henri Fiocca, behind. But staying would almost certainly mean capture. Resistance leaders understood that experienced operatives were more valuable alive and operating from Britain than imprisoned or executed in France. So in early 1943, Nancy Wake joined an escape attempt toward Spain. Crossing the Pyrenees was no small undertaking. The mountain range was harsh, unpredictable, and heavily patrolled. Guides, known as passeurs, led small groups through narrow, freezing passes. Travelers carried little food. They moved mostly at night. Snow and exhaustion claimed lives every year. Nancy's first attempt failed. Increased patrols forced the group to turn back. The second attempt collapsed after a warning of German searches along the route. On the third attempt, she succeeded. The journey took days. They moved in silence, climbing steep ridges and sleeping in caves or abandoned huts. At any moment, a German patrol or collaborationist militia could appear. Capture in the mountains often meant immediate execution. When she finally crossed into Spain, there was no celebration. Spanish authorities arrested many escapees for illegal entry. Nancy was detained and questioned, but with assistance from British diplomatic channels, she secured release and traveled onward to Gibraltar and then to Britain. London in 1943 was scarred but defiant. Buildings still bore the damage of bombing raids. Sandbags lined government offices. Yet inside secure rooms across the city, a different kind of war was being planned. It was here that Nancy Wake was recruited by the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. The SOE had been created to conduct sabotage and support resistance movements in occupied Europe. Its agents were trained to operate behind enemy lines with minimal support. Survival depended on adaptability, secrecy, and mental toughness. Nancy already possessed field experience, but SOE training would push her further. She learned to handle plastic explosives and time pencils, small devices that could delay detonation for hours. She practiced derailing trains using minimal charges placed with precision. She trained with pistols and submachine guns until handling them became instinctive. Instructors taught her how to resist interrogation, how to maintain cover stories under psychological pressure, how to recognize surveillance, how to kill silently if necessary. Parachute training came next. Night jumps were the standard. Agents would be dropped into fields lit only by coded flashlight signals from resistance members below. A miscalculated drop could mean landing in trees, rivers, or directly into enemy patrol zones. Nancy embraced the intensity. Fellow trainees later recalled her confidence and humor. She refused to be treated as fragile. If anything, she pushed herself harder to silence doubt. Then came devastating confirmation from France. Henri Fiocca had been arrested by the Gestapo. He was interrogated and tortured for information about Nancy's location and contacts. He refused to speak. In 1943, he was executed. Nancy did not learn the full details immediately. Wartime communication was fragmented. But when the news reached her, it was final. The Gestapo had killed her husband. Those who served with her later observed that she rarely spoke of it during the war. She compartmentalized the grief. There was no time for mourning. Europe was still occupied. The Allies were preparing for a massive invasion. The war was entering its decisive phase. Nancy volunteered to return to France. The timing was critical. Allied forces were planning the invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord. For the landings to succeed, German reinforcements needed to be delayed. Rail lines had to be sabotaged, communication systems disrupted, resistance fighters armed and coordinated. In April 1944, Nancy Wake boarded a bomber aircraft under cover of darkness. She wore a parachute harness, carried coded instructions and memorized contact names. The aircraft flew low across the English Channel and into occupied airspace. Anti-aircraft fire always threatened such missions. If the plane was hit, there would be no rescue. When the signal light turned green, she jumped. The air was cold and violent, the ground invisible. Seconds stretched. Then the parachute deployed, snapping open above her. She landed in the Auvergne region of central France, rugged, mountainous terrain ideal for guerrilla warfare. Waiting below were members of the French resistance. Nancy Wake was back in occupied France, but this time she was not a courier moving quietly between safe houses. She was an official SOE liaison officer, tasked with organizing and strengthening armed resistance. The Maquis in the region consisted largely of young men avoiding forced labor, along with veterans, farmers, and political dissidents. They had courage, but often lacked coordination and supplies. Nancy's role was to change that. She began organizing weapons drops from Britain. Using coded radio transmissions, she arranged for aircraft to release crates of rifles, Sten guns, ammunition, and explosives into remote fields. Resistance members would retrieve the supplies under cover of darkness. She insisted on structure and discipline. Units were assigned responsibilities, communication channels clarified, security protocols tightened. Some male fighters initially questioned taking direction from a woman, but Nancy's field experience and decisive leadership quickly silenced skepticism. She did not lead from behind a desk. She participated in planning raids, evaluated terrain for ambushes, and traveled constantly between resistance groups. The stakes were immense. German forces in France numbered in the hundreds of thousands. If resistance activity became too visible too early, the retaliation could be catastrophic. But if they did nothing, German divisions would move north unimpeded when the Allied invasion began. Nancy understood that timing was everything. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, sabotage operations increased. Rail tracks were blown apart in multiple locations, forcing German engineers into constant repairs. Fuel depots burned. Telephone lines were cut. Each small act forced the occupiers to divert manpower and attention. The White Mouse had returned, not as prey, but as a hunter. And the most dangerous phase of her war was just beginning. When Nancy Wake settled into the rugged Auvergne region after her parachute landing in 1944, she entered a different kind of battlefield, one without front lines, uniforms, or predictable rules. The Maquis fighters she joined were scattered across forests, hills, and remote farms. Many were young men who had fled compulsory labor service in Germany. Others were veterans of France's defeated army. Some had never fired a rifle before joining the resistance. They were brave, but bravery alone could not defeat the German war machine. Nancy's task as an agent of the Special Operations Executive was to transform scattered fighters into an organized force capable of coordinated sabotage. The terrain worked in their favor. The mountains of central France were difficult to patrol in large formations. Narrow roads twisted through valleys. Forests offered concealment. But German forces were experienced in counterinsurgency tactics. They retaliated swiftly and brutally. Nancy quickly established communication with London using wireless operators embedded in resistance cells. Arms drops were scheduled during moonlit nights. Villagers signaled safe landing zones using carefully arranged lights in fields. When British aircraft roared overhead, crates fell from the sky. Rifles, ammunition, explosives, medical supplies. Each successful drop strengthened the Maquis. Nancy insisted on training sessions. Fighters learned how to plant charges beneath railway tracks in ways that maximized damage with minimal explosives. They practiced ambush formations along wooded roads. They rehearsed rapid dispersal techniques to vanish before German reinforcements could arrive. Discipline was strict. Alcohol was limited. Security protocols were enforced. Loose talk could cost lives. In early June 1944, the long-awaited Allied invasion began in Normandy. News traveled quickly through resistance networks. It was the signal they had prepared for. Sabotage intensified immediately. Railway lines feeding German divisions toward northern France became primary targets. Resistance units struck at night, blowing tracks and retreating before dawn. Bridges were damaged, telephone exchanges destroyed, fuel convoys ambushed in narrow passes. The objective was not to defeat German armies outright, but to delay them, to slow their movement long enough for Allied beachheads to strengthen. German response was fierce. Entire villages suspected of aiding resistance were searched. Men were rounded up for interrogation. Some were executed as warnings. Nancy moved constantly between units, coordinating attacks and relaying intelligence. She traveled on foot, by truck, and sometimes by bicycle through dangerous terrain. One of her most demanding missions occurred when a German raid destroyed a key wireless set used to communicate with London. Without radio contact, arms drops would stop. Coordination with Allied command would collapse. Nancy volunteered to re-establish the link. She mounted a bicycle and rode over 500 kilometers through occupied territory in less than 3 days. The journey required stamina and nerve. She passed checkpoints using forged documents and improvised explanations. She slept little. Roads were monitored. Patrols were unpredictable. When she finally reached the backup operator, communication was restored. Supply drops resumed. As summer progressed, resistance fighters grew bolder. In one major clash, Maquis forces engaged German troops in open battle. Casualties mounted on both sides. While lightly armed resistance units could not sustain prolonged combat against trained soldiers, they inflicted meaningful damage before dispersing. Nancy did not romanticize the fighting. She later described it as chaotic and exhausting. Hunger, fatigue, and fear were constant companions, yet morale remained high. The myth of the white mouse grew within resistance ranks. Stories circulated of her confronting German officers without flinching, of her endurance during forced marches, of her refusal to retreat when operations faltered. German intelligence became increasingly aware that a highly capable foreign agent was coordinating resistance in the region. They renewed efforts to capture her. But Nancy Wake understood the landscape, the people, and the rhythms of guerrilla warfare. She was no longer merely evading the enemy. She was shaping the battlefield itself. By mid-1944, Nancy Wake had become a priority target. The Gestapo, along with German military intelligence, intensified operations in central France. Reports described organized sabotage disrupting troop movements. Officers demanded results. Though the precise number of agents assigned specifically to hunt her remains debated, German counter-resistance units were unquestionably focused on dismantling the networks she supported. Raids increased in frequency. Suspected collaborators were tortured for names. Rewards were advertised for information leading to the capture of resistance leaders. Nancy adapted. She changed safe houses frequently. She avoided predictable routines. Meetings were brief and often held outdoors. Couriers were rotated to reduce exposure. The Gestapo's strength lay in infiltration and psychological pressure. Informants posed as refugees. captured fighters were coerced into revealing contacts. But resistance cells operated on compartmentalization. Few members knew the full structure of the network. Even under torture, information was limited. Clashes between German patrols and Maquis units became more violent. In wooded ravines and narrow roads, ambushes erupted suddenly. Explosions tore through supply trucks. Machine gun fire echoed across hillsides. German soldiers were killed in engagements that seemed to materialize from nowhere. For the occupying forces, the enemy was invisible. This invisibility fed the legend. German officers reportedly warned subordinates about a foreign woman directing attacks. The white mouse was no longer just a nickname in reports, it had become a symbol of frustration. Psychological warfare played a subtle role. Every failed raid strengthened the perception that resistance leadership was always one step ahead. Yet danger was constant. Nancy later acknowledged that fear was real. Capture meant interrogation by professionals trained in extracting information through brutality. She carried a cyanide capsule during operations, as many SOE agents did, to avoid that fate if necessary. Despite intensified searches, she remained elusive. As Allied forces advanced through France after the Normandy landings, German authority began to fracture. Retreating units faced sabotage from both air attacks and ground resistance. In some regions, Maquis fighters openly engaged with growing troops. Nancy helped coordinate these actions, ensuring that attacks were timed to maximize disruption without unnecessary loss of life. By late 1944, liberation spread across France. German units retreated or surrendered. The Gestapo's grip collapsed. The long hunt had failed. The woman they had pursued for years had survived. And in surviving, she had helped ensure that resistance efforts contributed meaningfully to the Allied victory. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, celebrations erupted across liberated cities. Flags reappeared, church bells rang, crowds filled streets once patrolled by occupying soldiers. For Nancy Wake, victory brought relief, but not simplicity. She had lost her husband to the war. Henri Fiocca's execution by the Gestapo remained a permanent scar. Many comrades from the resistance had also been killed. Yet her contributions did not go unnoticed. France awarded her the Croix de Guerre 3 times. She received the Médaille de la Résistance. Britain honored her with the George Medal for bravery. The United States awarded her the Medal of Freedom. She became one of the most decorated women of the Second World War. Despite recognition, post-war life proved complex. Intelligence work required secrecy. Much of what she had done remained classified for years. Civilian life lacked the intensity and clarity of wartime purpose. Nancy later remarried and spent periods living in Australia and Britain. She even ran for political office in Australia, though she was not elected. Politics, she found, was a different kind of battlefield. As decades passed, historians began documenting the roles of women in wartime resistance more thoroughly. Nancy granted interviews that revealed her sharp humor and directness. She did not present herself as extraordinary. She often insisted she had simply done what was necessary. She spoke openly about combat, acknowledging that she had killed during operations. There was no pride in the act, only acceptance that war demanded harsh decisions. In her later years, she lived in London, maintaining connections with veteran communities. She witnessed a renewed appreciation for resistance fighters and intelligence operatives whose contributions had once remained in shadows. When she died in 2011 at the age of 98, tributes described her as fearless, determined, and fiercely independent. The nickname White Mouse endured, but history remembered more than the myth. It remembered a journalist who witnessed brutality and refused to ignore it. A woman who transformed from courier to commander. an operative who survived one of the most relentless secret police forces in Europe. Her story remains a testament to resistance, not as legend, but as lived reality. In occupied France, she had once moved silently through danger, hunted by one of the most feared organizations of the war. She survived, and in doing so, she helped tip the balance of a continent fighting for its freedom. If you would like, I can now combine all 5 expanded chapters into one seamless 50-minute continuous narration script with smooth transitions for full documentary production.